The year was 1596, and the countryside of Somerset was a tinderbox of discontent. Edward Hext, a justice of the peace, sat in his study, pen in hand, his face etched with worry. The letter he was writing to Lord Burghley, the most powerful man in the land, was a plea for help, but it was more than that, it was a warning. A warning that the fabric of society was unraveling, and the law was failing to hold it together. And every day I see the evidence of our failing system, Hext wrote, his hand trembling slightly. Felonies go unpunished, and those who should be brought to justice slip through our fingers. Simple country folk, already burdened by loss, are too afraid to testify. They fear the retribution of the criminals who prey upon them, and when they do come forward, the constables, often simple and sometimes negligent, let the criminals escape. Hext paused, his mind racing through the countless cases he had seen. Some criminals are so cunning that even when they are brought before a justice, they are let go. Others are burned in the hand, a punishment meant to deter, but it does little to stop them. After a month or two, the mark fades, and they are back to their old ways. The poor are left to suffer, and the vicious cycle continues. In another part of the country, William Lambard, a justice of the peace in Kent, was facing his own challenges. The year was 1586, and war was on the horizon. Lambard stood before the Kent Quarter Sessions, addressing a room filled with concerned citizens. "War brings with it the usual evils," he said, his voice steady but grave. "Men with more valor than virtue will take advantage of the chaos. They will break the law, thinking they can escape punishment. Our sons and servants will grow insolent, and drunkards and blasphemers will flaunt their lawlessness." Lambard's words were a call to action, but they also revealed the deep-seated fears of a society on the brink. The population was growing, and with it, the number of poor people. "The poor are multiplying," he continued, "and their children, following in their parents' footsteps, are often born into a life of poverty and crime. They live and die as rogues and beggars, without any hope of a better future." The issues facing Hext and Lambard were not unique. Across England, justices of the peace JPs were struggling to maintain order. In Yorkshire, Archbishop Edwin Sandys, a man of high moral standing, was grappling with a different kind of problem. He wrote to Lord Burghley, listing the names of several JP who, in his opinion, were unfit for their roles. "Robert Lee is a notorious adulterer, causing scandal and refusing to reform," Sandys wrote. "Peter Stanley is a known fornicator, with little wisdom and even less skill. Thomas Wentworth is a senseless blockhead who wrongs his poor neighbors, and Francis Alford is a man of small means, no skill, and no presence." These criticisms were not just personal attacks, they highlighted a systemic issue. The JPs, chosen to enforce the law and maintain order, were often flawed. Some were morally corrupt, others lacked the necessary skills, and still others were absent from their duties. The result was a patchwork of law enforcement that varied greatly from one region to another. Despite these challenges, the system of justices of the peace was still considered a crucial part of Tudor governance. Sir Thomas Smith, a prominent figure in the government, wrote in his treatise De Republica Anglorum that the JP were the Crown's trusted agents in the shires. "They are the ones who keep the peace, repressing robbers, thieves, and vagabonds," he wrote. "They meet regularly to report on the state of their counties and ensure that the laws are enforced." This system, he believed, was a model of good governance, a way to keep the people in check and prevent them from falling into chaos. But the reality on the ground was different. The JPs, while often dedicated, were hampered by a lack of resources, support, and sometimes the moral character of their peers. The Crown, for its part, continued to place increasing demands on the JP, entrusting them with more and more responsibilities. The workload grew, but the system's effectiveness remained uncertain. In the rural towns and villages, the struggle for order continued. The JPs, despite their flaws, were the last line of defense against the forces of disorder. And as the 1590s wore on, the question remained, could they hold the line, or would the fabric of society finally tear apart? In the second half of the 16th century, the Tudor government faced a whirlwind of social and economic challenges, especially in the localities. The problems ranged from poverty and unemployment to rising prices and social unrest. To tackle these issues, the government came up with a mix of policies and measures, some of which worked better than others. One of the biggest problems was poverty. The population was growing, and there were not enough jobs for everyone. This led to a lot of people struggling to make ends meet. The government tried to help by setting up poor relief systems. In 1572, for example, the Poor Law Act was passed, which made local parishes responsible for taking care of the poor. The idea was that the church and the community would work together to provide food, shelter, and work for those in need. This was a big step forward, but it wasn't perfect. Some parishes were better at it than others, and some poor people still fell through the cracks. Another issue was the rise in prices, known as inflation. This made it hard for people to afford basic things like food and clothes. The government tried to control prices, but this was difficult because the economy was changing. New trade routes and the discovery of silver in the Americas were causing prices to rise. The government also faced problems with the coinage. Silver coins were being hoarded or melted down for their metal, which made it hard to keep the economy running smoothly. To fix this, the government reformed the coinage in 1560, making sure that the coins were of good quality and value. This helped to stabilize the economy, but it didn't stop inflation completely. Unemployment was another big worry. As the population grew, more people were looking for work, but there weren't enough jobs. The government tried to create jobs by encouraging new industries, such as the wool trade. They also passed laws to force the unemployed to work, like the Statute of Artificers in 1563. This law said that people had to work in certain jobs, depending on their skills and the needs of the community. While this helped to reduce unemployment, it also caused some resentment because people didn't like being told what to do. Social unrest was a constant threat. People who were struggling often turned to rioting or protesting. One famous example is the 1595 food riots in London, where people were angry about high food prices. The government tried to prevent these uprisings by enforcing strict laws and using the army to maintain order. They also tried to address the root causes of unrest by improving living conditions and providing more jobs. The government also had to deal with religious issues. The Reformation had caused a lot of division, and there were still tensions between Protestants and Catholics. The government tried to keep the peace by enforcing religious conformity. For example, the Act of Uniformity in 1559 required everyone to attend Church of England services. Those who refused, like Catholics and Puritans, were fined or punished. This helped to keep the peace, but it also caused resentment among those who were forced to go against their beliefs. In the countryside, the enclosure of common land was a big issue. Landowners were fencing off land to use for sheep farming, which meant that poor farmers and tenants lost their access to the land they needed to survive. The government tried to stop this by passing laws, like the 1517 Act against enclosures, but it was hard to enforce. Some landowners ignored the laws, and the problem continued to cause unrest. Despite these challenges, the Tudor government did make progress. They set up systems to help the poor, reformed the coinage, and tried to create jobs. They also kept the peace, even if it meant using strict laws and punishments. The social and economic landscape of England was changing, and the government had to adapt. While they didn't solve all the problems, they did manage to keep things under control, at least for a while. In the second half of the 16th century, the Tudor government, particularly under Queen Elizabeth I, became increasingly involved in addressing local social and economic problems. This period marked a significant shift in government policy, as the royal administration began to see the regulation of economic and social life as a key method to maintain local order and stability. Initially, the government's concern with these issues was driven by the need to prevent social unrest and economic chaos. For example, during the 1550s and 1560s, the government passed laws to regulate the production of goods like wool and pins, and to combat practices like forestalling and engrossing, where merchants would corner the market on essential goods, driving up prices and causing hardship. The famous Statute of Artificers in 1563 was a comprehensive attempt to regulate employment, wages, and apprenticeships, aiming to stabilize the workforce and reduce unemployment. The government was also deeply concerned with poverty, especially during times of economic crisis. The 1590s, for instance, saw a severe economic downturn, leading to widespread unemployment and social unrest. In response, Elizabeth's government passed a series of poor laws, which introduced a system of compulsory poor relief at the parish level. These laws aimed to distinguish between those who could not work and those who would not, and provided a framework for local authorities to collect and distribute funds to the needy. However, the concept of Tudor paternalism has been revised by modern historians. They argue that the government's primary motives were not purely economic, but were more focused on maintaining order and stability. Many of the most significant legislative efforts followed periods of economic depression or social unrest, suggesting that the government often reacted to crises rather than implementing a coherent, long-term strategy. For example, the laws regulating cloth production and trade in 1552 were a response to the mid-Tudor commercial crisis, and the extensive legislation of the 1590s was a reaction to the fear that vagrants and criminals were threatening the social order. Moreover, it is now recognized that much of the socioeconomic legislation was not initiated by the central government, but by local authorities and members of parliament. Cities like London, Norwich, and Ipswich had already established sophisticated systems of poor relief before the government stepped in. The 1563 Poor Law, for instance, was largely inspired by these local initiatives. Similarly, the Statute of Artificers, while originating from the government, was significantly amended by MP with local interests, reflecting the influence of local concerns on national policy. The effectiveness of Tudor social and economic legislation has also been questioned. Some historians argue that local authorities often neglected to enforce these laws, and that private charities were more effective in providing relief to the poor. For example, between 1560 and 1600, local taxation contributed only about £12,000 to poor relief, while private charities provided £174,000. Additionally, local resistance to taxation and poor rates was common, with some communities preferring traditional methods of mutual aid. Despite these challenges, many historians still see the notion of Tudor state paternalism as valid. They point out that the government used various means, such as the Books of Orders, to address social and economic issues at the local level. These orders, particularly during the difficult years of the 1590s, were widely followed and helped maintain stability. The combined efforts of central and local authorities, including private charity, municipal schemes, and parliamentary statutes, were a significant response to the poverty problem. In the end, while Tudor social and economic legislation may not have eradicated poverty, it likely helped to maintain social order and stability. The government's efforts, although imperfect, may have prevented worse outcomes and contributed to a gradual change in attitudes towards poverty and social responsibility. This period of legislative activity reflects the complex interplay between central and local interests, and the government's role in shaping early modern English society. Parliament in Tudor times was like a big meeting where the king and important people from all over the country came together to make decisions. It had two main parts, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Lords was made up of nobles and important church leaders. The nobles, called Lords Temporal, were like the big bosses of the land, and the church leaders, called Lords Spiritual, were like the big bosses of the churches. They all sat in the same room and discussed important matters. The House of Commons was different. It was made up of two groups, the Knights of the Shires and the Burgesses. The Knights of the Shires were chosen from the countryside, and the Burgesses were chosen from the towns. At the start, the Knights of the Shires were more important, but over time, the Burgesses became more powerful as more towns grew and became important. Parliament had two main jobs. First, it made laws. The laws they made were called statutes, and these laws were very important because they were written down and followed by everyone. To make a law, the king, the lords, and the commons all had to agree. This meant that the king couldn't just make rules by himself. He needed the support of the important people in the country. Second, Parliament gave the king money. The king needed money for big things like wars or other emergencies. The king had his own money from his lands, but sometimes it wasn't enough. So Parliament would vote to give the king extra money, called subsidies. This money was based on how much land or goods people had. But Parliament didn't just focus on big national issues. It also helped with local problems. After they finished voting on taxes and laws, they would look at smaller issues that mattered to people in different parts of the country. These were called private bills, and they could be about things like fixing roads, building bridges, or helping local businesses. Parliament was also a place where people could get favors and help. Local representatives would use their time in Parliament to ask for things that would benefit their towns or the people they represented. This way, Parliament wasn't just about making big decisions. It was also about helping people in their local communities. Over time, Parliament became stronger and more important. The king still had a lot of power, but he needed the support of Parliament to get things done. This balance of power between the king and Parliament was an important part of how Tudor England was run. The story of Parliament during the first half of the Tudor era is a tale of gradual change and evolution. Under the reigns of Henry VII and Henry VIII, Parliament played a crucial but limited role, mostly serving the needs of the king rather than asserting its own power or independence. When Henry VII took the throne in 1485, he faced many challenges. He needed to secure his position and deal with threats from pretenders. To do this, he called Parliament frequently in the first decade of his reign. Parliament helped him by granting taxes and passing laws that supported his rule. For example, it recognized his claim to the throne and punished his enemies. However, once Henry VII felt secure, he called Parliament much less often. In the last 14 years of his reign, he only met Parliament twice. This suggests that he didn't need Parliament as much when his rule was stable. Henry VIII also used Parliament to support his rule, but in different ways. He needed money for his wars and for his personal expenses. Parliament provided this by granting taxes. The most famous example is the Reformation Parliament, which sat from 1529 to 1536. This parliament played a crucial role in breaking England from the Roman Catholic Church and establishing Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England. This was a significant change, as it gave the king more power over religious matters and allowed him to control the church's wealth. Parliament's role in these early years was primarily to support the king, not to challenge him. It granted taxes and passed laws that the king needed. However, this doesn't mean that Parliament was just a rubber stamp. There were times when members of Parliament, especially in the House of Commons, resisted the king's demands. For example, in 1523, the Commons strongly opposed the high taxes requested by Cardinal Wolsey, and it took a lot of effort to get the money the king needed. The Reformation Parliament is a particularly important example of how Parliament changed during this period. It was more than just a tool for the king. It was a place where the king and his subjects worked together to achieve significant changes. The laws passed during this time reshaped the relationship between the church and the state, and gave the king unprecedented power. This parliament also showed that Parliament could be a valuable ally to the king, especially when dealing with complex issues like religious reform. When Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558, the role of Parliament continued to evolve. Historians used to think that the House of Commons became more independent and assertive during Elizabeth's reign, especially in the early years. They believed that a group of radical Protestants, known as the Puritan Choir, pushed for a more radical religious settlement and tried to influence Elizabeth's policies. However, more recent research suggests that this view is too simplistic. Elizabeth's parliaments were still primarily called to support the king's, or in this case, the Queen's needs. They granted taxes, passed laws, and dealt with issues like the succession and the war with Spain. While there were some instances where members of Parliament challenged the Queen, these were relatively rare and often involved individual members rather than organized opposition. For example, Paul Wentworth and his brother Peter protested against royal control of the House, but they were not widely supported. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, Parliament had become a more significant part of the government, but it was still closely managed by the Crown. The concept of the king in Parliament meant that the monarch and Parliament worked together, with the king being the dominant force. Parliament's ability to grant taxes and pass laws made it an essential part of the government, but it did not yet have the independence that would come in later centuries. The story of Parliament during the Tudor era is one of gradual growth and change, but it is also a story of the king's or queen's continued dominance. Parliament served the needs of the crown, but it also began to play a more active role in the government, laying the foundations for the more independent Parliament that would emerge in the future.